These are the German soldiers who thought Americans were mocking them by making them pick tobacco in Kentucky. This is the story of how Nazi racial ideology collided with American agricultural reality during World War II, creating one of the most ironic chapters in POW history. In 1943, the first German prisoners of war arrived in Kentucky. They were part of the 378,000 German soldiers captured and sent to camps across America. Many were hardened Wehrmacht troops, some were SS, and most believed deeply in Nazi ideology. They expected harsh treatment, maybe even execution. What they didn't expect was to be sent to work in tobacco fields. The German POWs reacted immediately and viscerally. To them, tobacco work wasn't just manual labor, it was a calculated insult. In Nazi Germany, they'd been taught that tobacco cultivation was the work of slaves, tied directly to America's shameful past. Now here they were, members of the supposed master race, being told to bend their backs in Kentucky's tobacco fields. Many believed the Americans had deliberately chosen this work to humiliate them, to break their spirits by forcing them to do what they considered the most degrading labor imaginable. But the Americans weren't trying to mock anyone. They were desperate. With millions of American men fighting overseas, farms across Kentucky faced catastrophic labor shortages. Tobacco powered Kentucky's economy, and without workers to harvest it, entire communities faced ruin. The arrival of German POWs seemed like a practical solution to a practical problem. The fact that these prisoners found the work insulting never even crossed most American officials' minds. Camp Breckinridge, near Morganfield, Kentucky, became the center of this cultural collision. The camp held up to 3,000 German POWs at its peak, and every morning, trucks rolled out carrying prisoners to farms across Henderson, Union, and Webster counties. The POWs earned 80 cents a day for their labor, decent money they could spend at camp canteens. By every measure of the Geneva Convention, they were being treated fairly, but the Germans didn't see it that way. The first tobacco harvest, using POW labor in the summer of 1943, was tense. German soldiers who had conquered France and marched across Russia now found themselves learning to cut and hang tobacco leaves. Some initially refused to work, declaring it beneath the dignity of German soldiers. Guards reported that when the POWs did work, they often sang German military marches, their voices carrying across the fields, unnerving local farmers who wondered what kind of men these were. What complicated the situation even more was that many German POWs had never actually seen tobacco plants before. Germany imported its tobacco rather than growing it. They didn't understand that in Kentucky, tobacco wasn't associated with slavery the way cotton was in the Deep South. It simply kept the state's economy running. Local farmers weren't trying to degrade anyone, they just needed their harvest brought in. The irony deepened when you consider who guarded these German prisoners. Often, it was black American soldiers, men who, under Nazi racial doctrine, were considered subhuman. Here were members of the master race taking orders from people their ideology taught them to despise, working in fields they associated with slavery. The mental gymnastics required must have been staggering. As weeks turned to months, something interesting began happening. The initial outrage started fading, replaced by grudging acceptance and, in some cases, genuine surprise. The POWs ate well better, in fact, than many German civilians back home. They received medical care, mail from home, and access to recreational activities. Some began realizing that perhaps the Americans weren't mocking them after all. The International Red Cross made regular camp inspections, and their reports consistently found conditions that met or exceeded Geneva Convention requirements. POWs worked 8 to 10 hours daily, similar to American agricultural workers. They had weekends off, attended religious services, and even organized theatrical performances and sports leagues within the camps. By 1944, the POW labor system had become surprisingly efficient. German prisoners provided an estimated 10% of all agricultural labor in the United States during the war years. In Kentucky, they became a familiar sight in rural communities. Some farmers began seeing them less as enemy soldiers and more as young men far from home. Relationships developed, carefully supervised, of course, but genuine nonetheless. The stories that emerged from this period reveal the strange humanity that can bloom even in wartime. There were German POWs who learned to appreciate bourbon, who developed a taste for American cooking, who sent letters home describing the peculiar kindness of their captors. Some farmers reported that their POW workers would carefully tend plants, taking pride in their rows of tobacco despite their initial resistance. But not all the Germans adapted. The camps housed their share of devoted Nazis who never abandoned their ideology. These hardliners continued viewing the work as deliberate humiliation, maintaining secret resistance networks within the camps and planning escapes. They pressured fellow prisoners who showed any signs of cooperating with the Americans, creating tension within the POW population itself. The camp authorities navigated these divisions carefully. They separated the most fanatical Nazis from the general population, sending them to special high-security camps. But for most German POWs in Kentucky, the daily routine of agricultural work gradually wore down their resistance. It's hard to maintain ideological fervor when you're tired from honest work and well-fed by your supposed enemies. As 1945 dawned and news of Germany's deteriorating position filtered into the camps, the atmosphere changed again. POWs who had once sung Nazi marches now worked in subdued silence. Some began worrying about what would happen when they returned home. Would they face punishment for cooperating with the Americans? Would their families still be alive? When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the POW's status shifted again. They were no longer enemy combatants, but displaced persons awaiting repatriation. The process dragged on slowly. Many wouldn't leave Kentucky until 1946. During this limbo period, some POWs expressed reluctance to return to a destroyed Germany. They had seen American abundance, experienced fair treatment, and now faced returning to a homeland in ruins. The final departures from Kentucky's POW camps in 1946 marked the end of this peculiar chapter. Trains carried the last German soldiers away from the tobacco fields they had once viewed as symbols of mockery. Some left with changed perspectives on America and democracy. Others remained unrepentant Nazis to the end. But all had participated in one of history's strangest ironies. What makes this story particularly compelling is how it reveals the power of preconceptions and propaganda. The German POWs arrived in Kentucky convinced that tobacco work was psychological warfare, a deliberate attempt to break their spirits by associating them with American slavery. They couldn't conceive that Americans simply needed agricultural workers and that tobacco was just another crop that needed harvesting. The Americans, for their part, never fully grasped why the Germans found the work so offensive. To Kentucky farmers, tobacco meant honest work that put food on the table and kept communities alive. The cultural gap between captors and captives created a misunderstanding that took months or even years to bridge. In the decades after the war, some of these German POWs returned to Kentucky as visitors. They came to see the places where they had spent their captivity, to meet the families of farmers they had worked for, to try making sense of that strange period in their lives. These return visits often revealed how profoundly the experience had affected them. Men who had arrived as convinced Nazis left with a more nuanced understanding of America and its people. Today, little remains of Kentucky's POW camps. Camp Breckenridge is now a wildlife management area, its barracks and fences long since demolished. Historical markers note where thousands of enemy soldiers once lived and worked. Museums display artifacts, canteen cups, handmade crafts, photographs of young men in POW uniforms standing in tobacco fields. But the story lives on in its contradictions and ironies. Nazi soldiers who thought they were being mocked by being forced to work in tobacco fields. American farmers who just needed help with their harvest. Black soldiers guarding white supremacists. Enemies becoming, if not friends, at least something more complex than the propaganda on either side had suggested. This is what happens when ideology meets reality, when the stories we tell ourselves about our enemies collide with the actual human beings in front of us. The German POWs who worked Kentucky's tobacco fields expected mockery and humiliation. What they found instead was something far more unsettling to their worldview: ordinary Americans treating them with basic decency while expecting them to do an honest day's work. In the end, the tobacco fields of Kentucky became an unlikely classroom where Nazi ideology withered under the simple reality of shared human experience. The POWs who thought they were being mocked discovered something their leaders never wanted them to know: that their enemies were human beings just like them, worried about their crops, their families, and making it through another day of war.